Hello and welcome. Welcome, everyone. Okay, I know we have a packed house here, and I want to thank those of you who are standing in the back. We appreciate it. We're going to try to make you as comfortable as possible for this exciting program. So I'm Karen Wolf, and I am so delighted to welcome all of you to the John Carter Brown Library for this joint event with the History Department. I hope many, if not all of you, have or will be using the JCB's extraordinary collections and have or will visit our exhibits, either online or in person, including our newest exhibit, Learning to Sail, Living at Sea, Vernaculars of Maritime Knowledge. As a library devoted to the early Americas, since the middle of the 19th century, the JCB's collections have been developed to address questions about this essential place and period in so many respects as a library of colonialism, the very foundation of our modern world. The JCB's fellowship program, and I'm so happy to see so many fellows or former fellows here, annually brings more than 50 scholars a year through our physical and digital doors, and many, many more researchers from our campus and from all over the globe to think through the multidimensional peril and promise, vigor and violence of a world made by colonialism. So as we gather in this beautiful reading room, I want to note two things. First, how very, very grateful we are for all of you who support the JCB's work and the work of research and knowledge making that happens here. And second, how much events like this one contribute to the intellectual community that makes that knowledge manifest, including with our wonderful colleagues and co-hosts in the History Department. So it's with particular pleasure we find it especially appropriate to gather this afternoon to celebrate and discuss Seth Rockman's brilliant new book, Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery. We're going to hear from Seth himself first, and then perspectives from Sven Beckert and Keisha Blain. I'll start by introducing Seth, and then each of them in turn, and then we'll have time for some Q&A, and afterwards, a reception for much more conversation. So to Seth. One of the many joys of coming to Brown has been having Seth as a colleague and interlocutor. Perhaps I do not need to note that Seth is Professor of History here at Brown University, but it's a real pleasure to note that title, and so I do. Seth is an incredibly energetic and incisive scholar whose first book, Scraping By, Wage Labor, Slavery, and Survival in Early Baltimore, is foundational to his reputation, frankly, and his leadership in the histories of economy, capitalism, labor, and slavery. He thinks and writes so capaciously, and he convenes people to tackle big questions. Among the striking things about Seth's career, I think, is how regularly he has brought together scholars across fields and disciplines. A few examples would be the conference and then the volume he edited with Sven Beckert, about whom more in a moment, on Slavery's Capitalism, A New History of American Economic Development, which galvanized inquiry in the new history of capitalism. I'm a particular fan of what Seth might call a historiographical deep cut, an essay he wrote on the history of class for the Journal of the Early Republic some years ago. And more recently, he's been writing with several colleagues about a new labor history of science. Next, if that's all not enough, next he'll turn to a volume in the Storied American History series from Penguin, where Seth will focus on the critical years between the American Revolution and the Civil War. He is, as most of us know, indefatigable in his scholarly energy, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the breadth and depth of his research. And for Plantation Goods, among others of the many, many archives and collections he's consulted, I'm particularly glad to say that the JCB's collections proved useful. Seth.
This is an extraordinary treat. I'm without words, and those of you who know me know that that doesn't happen very often. To look out and see so many people who come from all parts of my life, all parts of my long, now 20-year plus career at Brown, this is just incredibly moving, and I just want to thank you all. Of course, I want to thank Karen and Gianna Chavez for organizing this event, Sven, Beckert, and Keisha Blain for speaking about this book, my many history department colleagues who are here today, friends from near and far. It's really special. And of course, to see President Paxson here as well is very meaningful to me. So thank you for being here. The book that I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so is very much a Brown book, I think reflecting my time on the faculty here. And there are a couple reasons why I would say that this is a Brown book. One, its questions very much emerge from the conversation that I entered when I came to Brown, that is to say, the Slavery and Justice Initiative that was just getting underway back in 2004, and I had the opportunity to participate in some of the research that was asking these incredibly important questions about New England's relationship to the transatlantic slave trade, and particularly the ways in which families like the Browns here in New England maintained long-term connections with not just the slave trade, but with the provisioning trade. That is to say, taking the produce of Rhode Island farmers and bringing it to places like Barbados and Jamaica. And those questions of how provisioning can organize an economy of slavery remain at the heart of plantation goods. A second reason this is a very Brown book is because some of the material culture methodologies that became crucial to the arguments I wanted to make here developed in conversation with mostly archaeologists at the Joukowsky Institute, who invited me to be part of a working group now 15 years ago called Material Worlds that put a body of scholarship in front of me that fundamentally changed the questions I would ask as a historian, thinking about the agency of non-human things and the ways in which we must tell histories that somehow are human and also more than human. This is also a Brown book in so many ways because, of course, the things that I've learned from the graduate students and undergraduates that I've had a chance to speak with about these topics over the years, whether in a graduate seminar called Slavery's New Materialisms some years ago, or in my freshman seminar called A Textile History of Atlantic Slavery, and I'm so glad to see some of the veterans of that course here in the room with us today. It's also, of course, a Brown book because it received a tremendous amount of support from UTRA students who helped me with research, from graduate students who contributed to the research, funds from the School of Professional Studies, from the Simmons Center, from the Department of History, from the Dean of the Faculty. All of these things made this book possible, as did the support of archivists and curators and librarians here at the John Carter Brown Library, the Hay Library, and the Rockefeller Library. So this is my opportunity to say to all of you, thank you. This wouldn't have happened without you, and it really is a tremendous thing for me to get to say this and to convey my appreciation to you. I will now race you through the book to give you some sense of what we're here to talk about. And in many ways, the book begins with a map that looks something like this. And it begins with a set of questions about how to connect the circle you see up at the top to the circle you see at the bottom. That is to say, how in the 19th century can we connect the histories and lives and livelihoods that unfolded in, on the one hand, New England, that in the early 19th century is undergoing an industrial revolution, and places in the Deep South that had very recently been indigenous lands appropriated or expropriated by the United States government in a series of wars in the early 19th century and rapidly converted into the most valuable plantation lands on an expanding cotton frontier. And trying to figure out the relationship between these two places, of course, you might imagine, well, this could help explain the coming of the Civil War. And that is absolutely one of the things that I try to think about in this book. How do we think about these regions in symbiosis rather than as antagonists? And by thinking about the ways in which these economies coexisted for so long raises new questions about exactly what would happen in 1860 and 1861. But these questions of slavery and capitalism are, of course, bigger questions that scholars have tried to wrestle with now for generations. And we know in our own time, whether through the Slavery and Justice Report, through the 1619 Project, the arguments about slavery's relationship to capitalism have been controversial. But rather than thinking this through in sort of abstract ways, I wanted to try to make this as concrete as possible, to focus on things you could hold in your hand and try to distill these relationships into things like shoes and hats and hoes and shovels and boots, the plantation goods that, in fact, give this book its title. This is a term that had currency in the 19th century, and people, whether in the North or the South, whether free or enslaved, whether black or white, would have understood plantation goods as a category of things manufactured to support the plantation economies of the American South. The argument that I make in the book is one that focuses through these relationships and argues that on the one hand, the South would essentially outsource the crucial infrastructural labor that was necessary to sustain plantation economies, looking for ways to organize enslaved people's labor more directly towards the production of plantation commodities, and thus to call upon New Englanders to make these kinds of things and to make them more cheaply than in fact could be produced in plantation spaces. And if the South is engaged in a project of outsourcing, the North, I argue, is engaged in a process of offshoring. That is to say, at the moment at which the North is ending legal bondage and declaring itself committed to free labor economies, it is nonetheless as deeply connected to slavery as perhaps it has ever been. It just happens to be slavery that is taking place several hundreds, if not several thousand miles away. And so thinking about offshoring and outsourcing allows me to put these two regions together. And the way that the book is organized is through a method that is called by scholars in a number of fields following the things. So I start in the New England communities where a group of entrepreneurs think about ways to make indestructible hose and durable cloth. And I go through those communities and look at the labor processes that make these goods. I look at the middlemen and merchants and advertisers who create this interregional economy by moving goods from one place to the next. And then finally, the book's last section ends up in plantation space, looking at the ways in which slaveholders created a whole series of aspirations and fantasies of mastery through these artifacts, and the ways in which enslaved people built a material culture upon goods that they did not themselves directly produce, but that they could mobilize in a series of ways to make political claims and ultimately to challenge the system of slavery itself. For starters, I spend a great deal of time here in New England, and this is a map which, if you can see, has a series of arrows pointing at small communities, places that are like South Kingston, Rhode Island, or Collinsville, Connecticut, or Haddam, Connecticut, or North Brookfield, Massachusetts, places that are fairly obscure to you today that you may not have heard of, but in the 19th century constituted what I call a New England plantation belt, where virtually every family is organized in such a way to produce these goods, sometimes being summoned into factory spaces and other times through an outwork system that brought yarn or brought pieces of leather into private homes where people who were normally farmers could spend their evenings sewing, weaving, stitching, making these kinds of things that would ultimately end up in plantation spaces. And by focusing on these small New England communities, it allowed me to do the thing that I like best as a historian, which is to focus on sort of social and labor history and get really detailed into, or go really deep into these kinds of documents, ledgers, payrolls, other kinds of scraps from the past that contain data, if you will, but mostly contain names. And my effort in this book was to try to do work with these kinds of names to figure out how someone here, like Daniel Gould's wife, made sense of the fact that she spent June of 1838 making 6 shirts and 6 pairs of pants that would end up on the legs and on the arms of enslaved people several thousand miles away. Daniel Gould's wife is someone named Penelope Rodman, and she's someone who plays a prominent role in this book. And I spend a lot of time in the book thinking about her work life. Was she thinking as she was making jackets for enslaved people to wear that she was somehow lessening their suffering and comforting the downtrodden? Was she humming a minstrel tune? Was she thinking about enslaved people as the reasons why her fingers were hurting late at night? Or was she thinking about the nicer goods that she would be able to acquire for herself and for her children based on the labor that she would perform here? All of these things are part of the kinds of stories of someone like Penelope Rodman and so many other women in New England like her, whose lives and livelihoods were profoundly connected to this economy. But if this is one end of the social history sort of archive, the other end looks like this. This is a sheet from a plantation in Louisiana called the Providence Plantation, and it contains the names of men and women who would be wearing someone like Penelope Rodman's handiwork. This is a list that a slaveholder sent to a Rhode Island manufacturer, naming several dozen people, giving their ages, their heights, their sexes, their shoe size, some descriptions of what their bodies might have looked like in hopes of getting, again, ready-made clothing from a New England factory rather than devoting enslaved women's labor to making this on the plantation. And so as I think about how Penelope Rodman's handiwork ended up in a place like this, right? I also want to ask questions about how enslaved people would have made sense of this. Would they have created a different kind of geographical imaginary, knowing that a woman in the North had made their clothing? What if she made it poorly? Would their work lives in a plantation, on a Louisiana plantation, look different? What were the implications, for example, of not being able to move sort of easily through the fields when you're being compelled to labor under forms of violence? What about being warm when the weather turns cold? What about feeling attractive in clothing that you did not yourself select, but had the opportunity perhaps to modify through dyeing or through re-sewing or through patching or any of the other kinds of maintenance activities that enslaved people invariably had to undertake in order to make this clothing work? And so in this story, I try to tell in this book, I try to tell these stories side by side, right? How we can have a story that moves from a New England farm woman to an enslaved seamstress in Louisiana, and think about the ways in which these lives and livelihoods are bound together. The person at the heart of this book, I suppose, though, is the kind of person who gets the ball rolling, and that's a man named Roland Gibson Hazard, who's a Southern Rhode Island entrepreneur, and he and his brother are emblematic of the many different kinds of New England entrepreneurs who think to themselves, you know, if I could make an indestructible hoe, I could become a millionaire. And they go to work applying the same kinds of entrepreneurial energies and innovation that makes New England a hotbed of new kinds of clockworks and new kind of machinery, but also new kinds of textiles that will be marketed to the South as performance wear for enslaved people. The Hazards, what distinguishes them in this business is that they conduct an enormous amount of what I call in the book plantation R&D. They spend about 6 months each year through the 1820s into the 1840s traveling through the South from Charleston to New Orleans, and in the process gather information from slaveholders, from merchants, and most importantly for my purposes in this book, from enslaved people themselves. And so their archive in New England is full of basically, I spoke with Colonel Jones's people. They said last year's woolens did not hold up through the picking season. They should be woven more tightly and also twill woven rather than plain. And with that kind of evidence, it becomes possible to think about enslaved people as participating in this process of design, and their preferences or their feedback ends up helping to shape the work lives of a woman in New England who might in fact be sitting up at a loom. I also then try to connect it to the merchants who are integrating this economy. This is the card of a Charleston merchant named William Ripley, who by 1828 is already advertising goods made in New England by name brand. Hazard's Negro cloth. And Negro cloth is the term that travels in the 19th century, and again, that would have been legible to slaveholders, to enslaved people, to northern manufacturers, to merchants, as any kind of textile that was designed or intended to be worn by enslaved people. It becomes a way in which the movement of these material goods, the creation of this consumer economy, also offers a chapter in thinking about the making of race and white supremacy in American society, as ideas of difference are articulated through the idea that some cloth is not just cloth, but actually Negro cloth. I'm going to skip ahead very quickly to tell you where I really want this book to sort of find its impact. And that is, of course, in thinking about the end users of these goods, enslaved men, women, and children who are some of the first Americans to wear ready-made clothing. This is a detail from an 1848 genre painting by the artist Richard Caton Woodville called War News for Mexico. At the center of the scene, not pictured here, a group of white men are reading a newspaper and talking about the United States' military conquest. But in the corner, on the periphery, in the most emblematic American part of the picture of all, in red, white, and blue, you see an enslaved child wearing tattered rags and a man wearing a rather substantial red woolen shirt, blue woolen pants that have been patched, and a pair of shoes that were almost certainly made in North Brookfield, Massachusetts, and that traveled under the trade name in this period as russet brogans. And in thinking through the ways in which enslaved people ultimately, as the end users of these goods, made sense of them, my approach has been to think in ways that are a little bit different from the existing scholarship. I became much less interested in what these goods sort of meant and much more interested in how they worked, focusing a great deal on the performance qualities of various kinds of fabrics, and if you can imagine such a thing, their capacities to wick moisture, or on the ergonomics of an axe and the ways in which the particular design of a blade or the angle of or the curve of a handle created real implications for the work lives of enslaved people or the affordances of a pair of shoes. And so as I then move through the material artifacts that might be at the center of this book, this in fact being an 1838 russet brogan manufactured in North Brookfield, and perhaps focus on its sole, which is affixed through wooden pegs and several nails, creating a very stiff bottom that at the end of the day had huge implications not only for enslaved people's capacity to move through space, but also for the surveillance regime of the plantation economy, as people were not able necessarily to be quiet or to be identified in fugitive slave advertisements through their shoe sizes, right? If shoes were in fact a crucial aspect of Black fugitivity, a crucial element of enslaved people's politics, whether that meant moving to see a spouse on a neighboring plantation at night, or gathering in the woods to strategize about how to deal with a particularly violent overseer, shoes were incredibly important. But what shoes gave, they also took away. And the idea that this man named Marioth could be recaptured precisely because his shoes are in a size 13 has everything to do with this interregional trade in goods. Let me wrap up here. I started by saying that this book is very much a brown book. And I guess to reflect on that a little bit more, it's a bit idiosyncratic, it's a bit idealistic, and it is very much driven by a concern for the world we've inherited and the world we hope to inhabit. And to that end, I want to say, finally, the way in which this book, I think, intersects with our contemporary moment. It is a book that is fundamentally about the moral and economic entanglements of consumers and producers across a lengthy supply chain. And this is not unfamiliar to us at a moment of carbon footprints, of fair trade coffee, of sweatshop-free sweatshirts, and dare I say, at a moment of untainted university endowments. And one of my goals in thinking in this way is to remind us that we are not the first. We are not people for the first time struggling with how to make sense of our moral entanglements with systems that we don't feel very good about. We are not the first to try to figure out how to go on living, even as we recognize that there's so much in the world that we wish could be otherwise. I argue in this book that, in fact, the entanglements that come along this lengthy supply chain are the emblematic experience of Western modernity over the last 500 years. And thus, at the end of the day, this book is not about a series of smoking guns that reveal, aha, the North is complicit in slavery. That's not going to surprise anyone here. Rather, this is a book that tries to take complicity as a given, to recognize that it is endemic, it is baked in, it is simply everywhere. And so the question for us as scholars, as historians, as citizens of the world is to ultimately ask how people in the past made sense of that complicity, how they challenged it, how they chose to live with it and to within it. And ideally, thinking in these terms gives us at least a few ways of, again, recognizing the fact that we are living in precedented times and that we are coping with our own similar kind of entanglements today. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Seth. So it's a joy to have with us today Seth's colleague and co-editor, Professor Sven Beckert. This is a very brief introduction here, but Sven is the Laird Bell Professor of History at Harvard University, where he also co-chairs the program on the study of capitalism and the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History. He is much awarded and the author or editor of a number of books, but let me just mention three. He co-edited Capitalism, A New History of American Economic Development with Seth Rockman, it turns out. He co-edited American Capitalism, New Histories with his Harvard colleague, Christine DeSanne. And his book, Empire of Cotton, A Global History, won the Bancroft Award, the Philip Taft Award, the Cundill Recognition for Excellence, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and the New York Times named it as one of the 10 most important books of 2015. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. Thank you so much, Seth, for inviting me to be part of this celebration. I feel greatly honored to be able to participate. I have been part of this project, I think, for quite a few years. I think I discussed it with you, Seth, when the idea just emerged. along the way. I read many of its chapters, and I just read the entire book as a whole. And from the beginning, this work struck me as a brilliant idea. And I think it's really one of the masterworks of recent history writings that we are here to celebrate. So I'm just going to speak very quickly, and I will try to emphasize what I think makes this book so stunning and so important. And in doing so, I will repeat some of the things that Seth already told you about. But perhaps Seth didn't emphasize sufficiently what I think is the book's perhaps most important contribution, and that is that, as you know, for a very long time, the history of the United States in the 19th century has been written as a history of two sections, of the South and the slave South and the free labor North. And these histories have been seen as fundamentally different and in conflict with one another. What Seth is showing definitely is that there is just one national history of slavery, and that the entire United States was implicated in the institution of slavery till its abolition in 1865. And in some ways, I think what the book does, when we published Slavery is Capitalism, there was still a lot of doubt out there if that is really true, that this is a national history. But I think Seth's book settles this discussion and makes it almost uncontroversial and commonsensical that we need to think about the nation as a whole when we think about the institution of slavery. So I think this is the single most important contribution of this book. What is also an important contribution of the book is how Seth makes this particular argument. He breaks down what is a very large question into a million small and often seemingly inconsequential interactions. It is a history from the bottom up. Manufacturers think of new markets. Massachusetts women weave a piece of cloth in order to buy a teapot. Enterprising young men seek new business opportunities and travel to southern cities. Enslaved peoples make claims to slightly improved clothing, and plantation owners seek to propel the plantation frontier into new territories and subcontract the making of the tools needed for that to northern manufacturers and northern workers. Seth tells the story of the national scope of the slave economy, not from the perspective of macroeconomic data or from the quantitative analysis of trade flows, as others have done and could be done, but from the bottom up, from the day-to-day interactions of very plain and regular people who usually do not make it into history books. And because his evidence is so powerful, so detailed, and so convincing, he can also afford to present his findings without hyperbole and without overheated rhetoric. But in its subtlety and its almost unbelievable empirical richness, it devastates all those who argue that there is a history that separates the free labor North from the slave South. In my reading, the book is also a testament for the possibilities, for the great possibilities of history as an academic discipline. By uncovering a hidden, almost unknown, and also quite mundane world of unremarkable people engaged in unremarkable activities and interactions, Seth illuminates in profound ways a crucial question of US history, but also, as we also just heard, of our contemporary moment. It reminds us of the power of history to illuminate, to show, and to explain. This book illuminates the history of economic life in the antebellum United States, I think, in ways that no other book that we have does. It is the best economic history of these decades. and can serve, I think, as a model of how such histories can be written about other moments in our nation's history as well. It is a brilliant history of labor. It is a brilliant history of business. And it is partly so because Seth allows us to see inside the homes of spinners and weavers, inside the factory, inside the plantation, and inside the counting office. It is always a forward-looking history. It looks from the past into the near future, and it allows the reader to understand that the future was unknown to the protagonists that he's writing about, and that each of them, in their own way, try to make sense of the world they encountered in which they were born into, and also an effort to shape that world. Capital owners could be weak, and workers could be strong. And they struggled constantly with one another to shape their lives, and with it, the economic history of the United States. It takes the reader into the material world of economic life. It is not a history of abstract processes, but it is a history of specific historical actors who are also named in the book, which I think is another really important strategy of presenting these materials. The book is also so impressive because the voice of the author is so notable, and you can hear the author speak to his audience. Sometimes Seth almost ventures into philosophical observations, and throughout he seems to be in a constant conversation with his protagonists, with the spinners, the weavers, the enslaved people, and the manufacturers and the merchants who appear in his book, questioning their ideas and their decisions as he tries to also understand them. He calls them out for the contradictions between their beliefs and their actions. But even when he does do so, he never gives up on his desire to first and foremost to understand them. He questions his protagonists. He does encourage his readers to consider how history, he does encourage his readers not only to consider the history, but also to consider how that history speaks to our contemporary life and to our contemporary concerns. Seth firmly believes that history is history. We can explain it, but we cannot change it. And at the same time, he invites us to think about the contingencies of the future, because this is the terrain of history that we can actually make a difference and can actually change things. The book stands out as a connected history of things that usually are kept apart: the North and the South, freedom and slavery, wage work and coercion, agriculture and industry. Merchants appear as much as enslaved workers, politics as much as the materiality of production. This creates a rich tapestry, and in doing so makes a strong argument about some of the most crucial questions we can ask about American history in the 19th century. This book is also, first and foremost, perhaps, a celebration of the craft of the historian. In my many years of studying history, there are only a few books that stand out in ways that make me remember exactly when I read them, where I read them, and how I read them. This book, and the books that opened up fresh vistas on long-gone words, while at the same time made me see that the world from new perspectives, books that gave me the sense of truly understanding a problem, to have learned something that will always remain foundational as I continue to thinking about history. Plantation Goods is exactly such a book. So thank you, Seth, for writing this book, and thank you for inviting me to join this celebration. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. So it is always terrific to be with my own longtime colleague now here at Brown, Keisha Blain, professor of Africana Studies and History. Keisha and her work on Black political thought and Black internationalism are much lauded, and she is the author or editor of a crazy number of books. I stopped counting, given that she only finished her PhD 10 years ago. Keisha's most recent book is an edited collection called Wake Up America, Black Women and the Future of Democracy, which was published by Norton in February. And it brings together the voices of major progressive Black women politicians, grassroots activists, and intellectuals for insights on how to create a more equitable political future. Keisha's next book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights, will be published by Norton in September and offers a sweeping history of human rights framed by the work and ideas of Black women in the United States from the early 19th century to the present. She also regularly writes for a number of media outlets, and she has a number of major appointments, including as a member of the Committee of Scholars for the Smithsonian American Women's Museum. Keisha.
Thank you so much, Karen, for the kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share a few remarks, and I will be brief. Looking forward to having this conversation on Professor Rockman's new book, Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery. There are so many things I can say about the book, but I will focus on what I see as one of the most powerful lessons we can learn from the book. First, I will highlight just some of the ways Professor Rockman skillfully draws on various fields of study, and also consider how he draws insights from a diverse body of evidence. This is truly a remarkable work of history, and you've already heard this multiple times, but I will emphasize it. It's one that centers the objects, the tools, and the other items used on plantations across the US South. By focusing on material culture, Professor Rockman tells a larger and even more significant story about the growth of the nation's economy. So much has been written about slavery as an institution, and while we often talk about how much slavery was vital to the growth and expansion of the US economy, we don't often consider the multiple layers of the story. What Professor Rockman has done is add a new layer to this history by grappling with the significance of plantation goods, as he explained, a 19th century term that describes the products that were made for use on the slave plantation. Following these objects from the moment of creation to the moment they are used on the plantation helps us understand the connections between the plantation economy and manufacturing in New England in very fascinating ways. In Professor Rockman's skillful hands, objects that might otherwise not hold our attention, shoes, clothing, and tools, in fact, help us understand the day-to-day lives of enslaved people, and also helps us understand the lives of New England laborers. In this way, plantation goods provides yet another example of how the experiences of enslaved people cannot be divorced from the lives of other Americans in the 19th century. We see this in very stark ways through Professor Rockman's discussion of the Hazard brothers. He brought them up earlier. The Hazard brothers of Rhode Island, Isaac, the oldest brother, manufactured clothing that would ultimately end up on slave plantations on the bodies of Black people many miles away. As Professor Rockman tells us, the family business was ultimately responsible for almost half of the clothing for enslaved people produced in the North. Isaac and his brothers understood the importance of the family business for building the local and national economy. But they did not think about the men, women, and children who would wear the clothing. They probably would not imagine that their lives, their wealth, their ability to build a life for themselves and their loved ones would be so intimately tied to the lives of the enslaved. But as Professor Rockman explains, the textile business owned by the Hazard brothers, as well as Southern planters, quote, shaped the terrain on which laboring people in both regions would contest the terms of their exploitation. The theme of exploitation looms large in this book. Professor Rockman offers invaluable insight into how enslaved people interacted with the clothing produced by the textile businesses across the North. He points out, for example, how enslaved people had to devise strategies to extend the use of the limited clothing allowance. The quality of the clothing was poor in many cases, and especially so considering the grueling labor that enslaved people endured on a day-to-day basis. And so even those who saw themselves as disconnected from the institution of slavery played a crucial part in the process of exploiting Black people. Textile owners in the North made a profit, and they did so literally on the backs of the enslaved. Professor Rockman also sheds new light on how working poor people were exploited in factories, for example. By offering a nuanced and in-depth material history of American slavery, plantation goods underscore how everyday objects made by American laborers in the 19th century were necessary for maintaining slave labor. This fact helps us understand the blurred lines between slavery and freedom. Those who were free were indeed tied to those who were bound. As a historian of the modern US, and by modern I do mean after 1865, I cannot help but think about what this story might mean in a more contemporary sense. Like so many others, it has been hard for me to make sense of the recent presidential election. I have more questions than answers. But as I revisited Professor Rockman's masterful book this week, I could not help but think about the broad implications that might apply to this moment. We live in a diverse nation, a democracy, a striving democracy at least, and while there has been so much progress since the 19th century, we are haunted by what literary scholar and cultural historian Sadia Hartman calls the afterlives of slavery. Our experiences are not the same. We still have to contend with a myriad of challenges that are very much connected to the history that Professor Rockman outlines in this very important book. But I am struck by an enduring message that I think we might need to hold on to in these turbulent times. And that is one about how much our lives are so interconnected. It makes me think about a quote from civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer, who once said, "Nobody's free until everybody's free." The context was not the same, but certainly connected if you think about it through the lens of the afterlives of slavery. I kept returning to this quote this week, reading this powerful book, and I think that this might be the lesson we might take from the book. So many lessons, certainly, but this one in particular, that we are linked to each other, even when we don't necessarily see it. Perhaps this is the vision, one of unity, that we need to hold on to as we consider the challenges of this moment and as we look to the future. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. So Seth is going to take some questions from this large audience, and I will do the job of pointing and directing microphones because we do have an online audience. So, questions? I know it's a big audience. I can start. I have questions. I have thoughts. Nobody's going to. All right. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. There we go. You're gonna have to wait for a microphone. Rats. I almost got my question out. Okay.
So, Seth, there's a belief that the Industrial Revolution really took in New England because of water power, capital, and the population for labor. But the South had water power, and they had rich people. So I'm thinking it had to have been somewhere in labor. So what was the difference besides the
It's a great question. And for those who didn't hear where Jed finished, it was basically, why didn't Southerners manufacture for themselves and simply save the shipping costs? Part of the answer is, of course, that if the bulk of the laboring population in the South is enslaved, the people who owned those human beings were making decisions about how to direct that labor. And for them, it was much more intuitive and also much more profitable to direct that labor towards the production of commodities for the world market. It is true, though, that every time the price of cotton seemed to fall, some Southern entrepreneur or some Southern politician would say, you know what, rather than spending so much money to, increasingly they would say, to spend so much money to enrich the people who spend all their time complaining about slavery and making us feel bad about our exploitative practices, we should just do this for ourselves. Those efforts last for about as long as a business cycle, at which point when the price of cotton goes up, Southern capital flows directly towards purchasing more plantations and more slaves. The book has a chapter that is about Southern